Peace and blessings. My name is Anson Asaka. I just wanted to take out time to talk about this horrible incident that happened in my community. This past Friday, 6 people were shot at York Road in Cold Spring here in Baltimore. This issue hits close to home. It's just a reminder of the kind of violence that plagues our community. For the past 5 or more years, over 300 people have been murdered in this city, shot and killed in this city, despite all the rhetoric of change from these politicians, despite proclamations from law enforcement. The violence continues to plague our city, and this is just another reminder of it. And this issue hits close to home because this is not that far from my house. It's blocks away from my house. It took place in the area that I pass every day on my way to work. It took place in the area where my daughter has caught the bus from to go to work. This is absolutely outrageous. It is crazy that we have this type of situation in Baltimore. And it is just a reminder of the violence that plagues our city. Again, for over the past 5 or more years, over 300 people have been shot and killed in this city. And sadly, too many of us have just accepted it as normal. We have accepted it as just the reality of living in Baltimore City. And I say to hell with that. There's nothing normal about 300 people being shot and killed every year in the city. There's nothing normal about that. There's nothing normal about 6 people being shot at an intersection in a city. There's nothing normal about that. Something must be done about this situation. It is time for us to do something about our community. Even though these elected officials mean well, they have failed our city. Anytime you got this situation where you have this perpetual, non-stopping cycle of violence every year, that means your politicians have failed you. And not only have the politicians failed our community, we have failed our community. We have to take responsibility for what happens in our community. This is not solely an issue of law enforcement, although law enforcement plays a role, an important role in addressing this violence, a role that cannot be denied. And although elected officials play a role in this issue, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, we play a role. We play a role in what happens in our community. Too many of us have embraced this stop snitching culture, this see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil culture, where we allow this type of violence to perpetuate and thrive while we remain silent. We don't want to say anything about anything happening in our community, and we wonder why our communities are going to hell in a handbasket. And we wonder why these criminals, these terrorists feel free to shoot and kill and deal in our neighborhoods. That will continue to happen as long as we do nothing and say nothing. Fortunately, we do have organizations in our community that are standing up against this violence. Organizations like Safe Streets and the Peace Movement, the Peace Team, and We Are Us. But more needs to be done. We need to be involved and engaged, and we need to back up and support those organizations that are about that life, that are about bringing peace to our city. And I will never stop believing that peace is possible. We don't have to live this way. We don't have to deal with over 300 people being murdered every year in our city. That doesn't have to be our reality. We have the power to change our reality and to change our situation. We don't have to live like this. You know, if warring nations can reach peace amongst themselves, then we can reach peace here in Baltimore. I believe that peace is possible. And that peace begins when we decide to take control over our communities. as you know, my imam has said, it's our community and it's our responsibility. Um, of course, there's a role for city and government, but we have a responsibility as well. We can't turn a blind eye to this violence plaguing our city. We have to stand up and do something about it. And I commend, Safe Streets for all that they do in our community, for bringing awareness around this issue. But if you know something, you need to say something. Somebody knows who shot up that block. And the question is, are you going to say something about it? The victims who were shot know who they probably can identify the suspect, but will they say something about it? Or will they allow this killer, this violent person to plague our community? That's the question. And, aside from the role of community, we have to look at the role of family. That is something that needs to be addressed as well. Because despite the best policy intentions and policies and all that kind of stuff, if you don't have a strong family, you don't have a strong community. If the mother's on drugs and the father's gone and the kids are left to raise themselves, you will continue to see this kind of violence plaguing our city. We have to have a holistic approach to this issue of violence in our city. We need to rebuild the families in our community. We need strong male role models in our community. And we do have groups that serve as mentors in our communities, but we need more of that. Too often, a lot of the people that participate in this violence, they don't have a family structure to rely on. They don't have Black male guidance to rely upon. So the streets become their daddy. The streets become their role model. That's what we see in our communities. It's the blind leading the blind. And, I was watching this video, this news report, where this mother was basically denying her responsibility. In a situation where her son was carrying a gun and all that kind of stuff, she was making excuses about her lack of parental involvement, about her lack of taking responsibility for her own child. It's time for us, instead of pointing our finger at the police and at the elected officials, you need to be looking in the mirror and asking yourself, what are you doing in your own household to prevent your young people from engaging in this kind of conduct? So aside from that, aside from the role of community and the role of family, we need to also talk about the role of these elected officials and law enforcement. Anytime you got 300 people murdered every year, that means your law enforcement system has failed you. Anytime you got over 300 people murdered a year, that means your politicians have failed you, not only in the city hall or, the mayor's office, but the state level and the federal level, because this is outrageous. We know the root causes of violence. We know there have been all these studies done about the connection between poverty and violence, the connection between a lack of education and violence, the connection between a lack of education and incarceration rates. But yet and still, we don't engage in a serious war to combat poverty in our community. We have these reforms passed around education here in Maryland, but we still see, and it's going to take some time to finally address this issue, but we have massive disparities in quality of education. We have massive disparities in wealth, based on race in the city. We have segregation, all these issues that have an impact on this violence plaguing our city. When young people don't have quality education and they don't have job opportunities, the job opportunity they take is the opportunity to sell drugs and destroy the community. That's what happens. When people are engaged in that drug trade, they end up using violence to protect themselves and to protect that particular trade. And it's no wonder that we see this violence plaguing our communities. Anytime you have these open air drug markets that are allowed to flourish without any kind of checks and balances, this is what you see. This is the kind of violence you see. You got drug markets right here on York Road that are allowed to flourish. People just openly sell drugs. And we wonder why there's violence in our community. We wonder why you have this sense of hopelessness and the sense that people just accept this violence as normal. These are the circumstances that we live under. So the bottom line is this: we all need to take responsibility. We all need to be involved and engaged. We need to support the organizations that are doing the work in our community to end this violence. We need to be involved in these organizations. We need to have more mentors in our community. We need to serve and act as mentors to guide our young people so they're not involved in this violence plaguing our city. We need policies to address this poverty plaguing our community. We need policies to address the educational disparities and the lack of opportunity. And we need to take responsibility for our own households.